Hello, welcome to the Sustain, Change and Grow podcast. Today I'm delighted to welcome Stephen Boucher, and we will talk about creativity, creative thinking, collective thinking, in all different areas of life. Welcome, Stephen.
Hi, Daniela.
Could you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, I'm Stephen Boucher, based in Brussels, French American, and I've always worked in public affairs in one way or another my whole career. I'm now 52. And over the past 10 years, I've taken a keen interest in how to get groups to think more creatively to solve public problems. So I'm the founder of a consultancy in that field, Dreamocracy. And our baseline is collective creativity for the common good. And a year ago, we started a nonprofit organization to share some of the principles behind collective creativity, and that is called Smarter Together.
I would like to start with the question, actually with the quote from Bob Hopkins. And Bob Hopkins started a movement called Transition Movement, and he wrote a number of books on the transition. And one of his latest books is From What Is to What If, Unleashing the Power of Imagination to Create the Future We Want. And one of the thoughts he brings in this book is that the only thing that we lack to solve climate change issue is imagination. Would you agree with him?
Yes and no. It's interesting because I wrote a book which had less visibility, and in French, before Bob Hopkins' book came out. In English, it's the Little Handbook of Political Creativity. And that was after working for a number of years, in particular at the European Climate Foundation, and realizing that, yes, we needed more imagination, we needed more creativity to tackle the climate crisis. So to answer your question, I would first say, from what I gathered at the time, the first instinct is to say, no, we don't need more imagination because, in fact, we have all the tools we need to solve climate change. We know what to do. We know what to do in terms of policies to put in place, of regulations, etc. We know what economic tools can work. We know the types of behavior that can help. We have lots of pieces of the toolbox, whereas perhaps some technological developments could help. Essentially, we have all the tools in the toolbox. But yes, we need imagination because obviously, and that's the conclusion I reached, and Rob Hopkins also, we are not successfully using the tools in that toolbox. So something does need to change. And we need to think of a different world, and we need to think of different ways of working together to use the tools that we have. So we don't need to invent new tools, but we need to be creative and imaginative about how to change our world and how to use what we have at hand.
Do you think that this toolbox and tools are limited to a group of people, and that for the majority of the people, the way they live and the way they project themselves in the future, it's mostly the same setup, the same framework, and just actually more limited, more restricted. And so that's what makes people fear the transition and the way the climate change will be addressed. Because actually they're not imagining a different future, a better future, but a more constrained present. So, and in this sense, so indeed, the tools, toolbox, policies, everything exists, but maybe it's not shared more widely. And many people don't appropriate this creative approach to the life.
I see different elements and aspects in your question, so maybe I'll unpack this. One of them is the ability to imagine a different future, to project ourselves into a better future. And certainly I feel a lot of eco-anxiety myself. You know, the news is bad and the trends are worrying. Nevertheless, it is important to be able to project yourself into a better future in order to mobilize energy. And The reason we chose the name for our outfit, Dreamocracy, uh, is essentially for that reason. That we have observed, and from many studies we know, that in order for a group to get out of a certain way of thinking, to see beyond the current limitations, it's important to visualize a different future. And this is not a naive posture. This is a requirement, whether at the individual or at the collective level. Actually, I prepared a number of references I'd like to leave with with the listeners of the podcast, and one of them is "Hope Matters" by a psychologist who talks very much about the environmental crisis. The title of her book is "Hope Matters: Why Changing the Way We Think is Critical to Solving the Environmental Crisis." So, indeed, one of the aspects I think behind your question is yes, we need to think differently and to imagine a better future in order to unleash creativity. So behind your question, I sense another possible question, which is this ability to imagine, to think, the standard expression outside the box, to be creative, etc. Is that something that is something that only a few people can do, those we see as the creative types? Yeah. And
Artists.
we tend to assist the artists, etc. We tend to think of somewhat crazy thinking people who dress wildly and who are more on the artistic side. It's interesting because that's a common myth. And another reference here, if you're curious, you could watch a great TED show on the internet if you type David Burkus, Burkus. He talks about the 8 myths of creativity. And that's one of them, thinking that creativity is for a certain type of people. Whereas creativity is a form of intelligence. Intelligence is the ability to solve problems. Creativity is the ability to generate novel solutions to problems. So I lost my keys. I need to be intelligent about this. A standard solution will be to ask a locksmith to come and unlock my door. Okay. Maybe a creative solution, because I don't have the money to call a locksmith in, will be to call my neighbor to jump over my balcony and open the back door. So intelligence is solving solutions, creativity is solving solutions with new original answers. And therefore, we all are creative in one way or another every day in our lives. And it's not just about being Salvador Dali.
Mm-hmm. And is it important for people to repossess their creativity as a way of the intelligent thinking? So why I'm asking this is that I think it's really common belief, as you said, like if you ask people if what they're doing at work is creative, or are they use creativity in their everyday life, I think most people will say no. Actually, starting from myself, I have never thought, about me doing research that it's creative work. So, like, what could be more creative than doing research? And is it important? Is it something that should be done? That people bring back the awareness of them being creative creatures to, reinforce this capacity?
Absolutely. I'm an evangelist of creativity, if that exists, because first it's necessary. If you look at the climate change crisis or environmental crisis or other public problems, we see that many of the solutions we have at hand are not working adequately or are not being implemented fast enough. So we need to come up with new ways to go about these problems. There's just no other option, right? But also, there's the psychological element that if you're a mildly or somewhat concerned citizen or professional or educator or parent, that you will feel some form of challenge. How can I contribute in a minute or bigger way to solving issues around me? And it can be crushing because it seems like the issues are becoming greater and greater and more complex. We have no option but to unleash the creative self in ourselves, to develop that ability to produce And again, the definition is creativity is the ability to produce solutions that are not only useful in a given context, but also original in a given context. I think that's a must, yeah.
And how, maybe I swap a little bit, so I will ask immediately for recommendations, and will ask you what would you recommend just ordinary people to unleash their creativity? So maybe you also have some reference books or just simple pieces of advice that everybody could do, from right after finishing this podcast.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly, I think the first thing is to realize how creativity is important and what we've already covered, that we all can contribute different forms of creativity, and therefore to decide that it should be part of our lives. So creativity, cultivating creativity is not just for the person who decides, okay, I'm at last going to write the novel I always wanted to write, so I'm going to cultivate my creativity in that direction. That is a wonderful endeavor, but we can do the same, thinking, well, how can I in my organization help it be more sustainable? Right. We see that it's facing different challenges, that people know about the issue, but they're struggling to change their behavior. Okay, I can be creative in that context. So I think the first step is realizing that we all have creative potential and we can nurture it. It's an ability, it's like a muscle. And in order to develop that muscle, like going jogging, the second step after that realization is understanding, being clear why. Why do I want to be creative? Is it for my kids? Is it for myself? Is it for, whatever is your motivation? And then, well, there are tons of resources and references. If you set a bit of time aside, you can dive into this incredible, rich field because there are many people who have documented how it can be done in different contexts. In light of your podcast, The Focus, I recommend reading Hope Matters. Why changing the way we think is critical to solving the environmental crisis. So that positive outlook, we can unleash our creativity and it will make a difference. There are resources online how to be more creative, the tools, the know-how, and I recommend here something called the DIY toolkit, do-it-yourself toolkit, produced by Nesta, which is the British innovation agency, a couple of years back. So they produced a toolkit which purpose is to enable anyone, individuals, organizations, to organize processes, to analyze problems, develop solutions, etc. It's a really super cool resource. And then there could be many others. There's lots of handbooks, etc.
Mm-hmm. From what I heard from you and from my personal experience, I think the first and the biggest element, which is really changing the perspective and that opens the creativity box, is actually the question which starts with how. So, right, you said it several times, like, how can I do it? How can I make the company more sustainable? How can I do my personal life more sustainable? And when I listen to people talking about things that they have to change, most of the time I hear people making a, let's say, a negative statement that something doesn't work, or that there are problems, or there are whatever, something difficult, etc. And for me, this is like, it's a blockage, it's a barrier. So you state there is a problem, and then you don't allow yourself to think beyond this barrier. Mm-hmm. Though when you restate the same problem as how can I remove this barrier, then immediately you can come up with multiple solutions. And I realized when I realized this, I was like, wow, that's super powerful. So maybe you can comment on this. I imagine that's not something that I invented. I imagine that's a common practice, right?
Absolutely. Well, indeed, the word that springs to mind behind what you're saying is constraints, right? We all face constraints, limitations in our lives. I worked at the European Climate Foundation. It's a philanthropic foundation which has significant money to support organizations to fight climate change. There'll never be as much money as the opposing forces. Even then, with significant resources, they're limited, right? We, in our daily lives, face constraints. Constraints are, first of all, the reason why we need to be creative. In every endeavor we have, we don't have unlimited resources. And we need to think, well, how could I reach my goals, even though I have not all the people I need, not all the money I need, etc. Now, I'd like to also highlight another reason why constraints are an ally of creativity, not just a reason. I'd like to do a little mind game with you, and our listeners can do it in parallel in their mind when listening to the podcast. So if I ask you, Delia, you live in Paris, right?
Right.
Okay. So can you think of a purple object?
Okay.
Tell me what springs to mind. You can handle, you can touch.
A true object, a balloon.
Okay, purple balloon.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, a purple object that is not made of plastic.
Well, apple doesn't qualify for purple, no?
Maybe
Can
just
it?
purple apples. Why not?
Okay, so then purple apple.
Okay. Well, what about a purple object that is not made of plastic and that you don't find in France, in Paris?
Like it's not produced there, or you can't find it?
You can't find it.
Purple lake.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think I've seen pictures of very pink lakes in different parts of the world, and maybe there are pink lakes, purple
like
lakes.
If there is a sunset, it can
Yes.
have a purple color.
Wonderful. So what happened in that process? You thought, first of all, of something that you could come across in Paris. Like you go to the Bois de Vincennes, and you have kids playing with balloons, and they have a purple balloon. Okay. When I introduce constraints, it's not made of plastic, you can't find it in Paris, you come up with very creative ideas of objects that 2 minutes ago you would not have thought of. They weren't in your mind. A purple lake, a purple apple. Brilliant, very creative. And I'm sure our listeners have the same thing. Every time you introduce constraints, you force your creativity. That's why poets have all these rules to write poems with certain rhymes and certain orders, etc. Or sometimes poets will do that. Okay? So not only are constraints a fact of life, which oblige us to think outside the box. We can't just use the old tools we had because they're not working anymore, or etc. But also they're actually a great opportunity to force us to think creatively. Yeah, that's a positive outlook on the climate challenge, for instance, and other environmental challenges. But yeah, we can be sad and anxious and sometimes depressed by the state of these challenges and the lack of resources we have to deal with them. But if we see them as reasons to be creative and actually drivers of our creativity, I think that can help a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Well, I really like the approach, this positive approach to see the constraints, because indeed, usually we take the constraints as a problem, as something which is limiting us, and it also blocks our thinking, right? We're like, okay, I would like it to be like this, and it doesn't work. So I like the approach that actually constraints help to unleash the creativity and to think differently. So very, very cool idea. Now I would like to move to another topic. So you mentioned in your introduction about collective creativity. And currently we hear a lot of different combinations. So you mentioned collective creativity. We hear about collective intelligence, about creative thinking. Could you please all these concepts and explain what is the difference between the three of them, and maybe also tell me and the listeners a little bit more which of the concepts we need the most to solve the problems we are facing?
Sure. I think we need all of them, but I'll
Okay.
address. So collective intelligence is the ability under the right conditions that groups have to produce better decisions, better solutions than the individual members of that group independently. So it's somehow 1+1 under the right conditions can be more than 2. It's, to say it differently, when collaborating or when interacting in specific ways under the right conditions, members of a group can produce, can emerge from that group better solutions than, again, what the members of that group could have produced on their own.
So maybe just stopping here. So is there any justification, any proof, any scientific evidence that the groups come with better solutions than individuals?
So collective intelligence is a vast field of study. Very happy here to advertise the Routledge Handbook of Collective Intelligence for Democracy and Governance that I helped edit and coordinate, that came out last year. And it's available open access. I'm happy to advertise it. As part of this handbook, some 74 authors contributed from all walks of science, neuroscience, social psychology, political science, etc. So, yes, there's plenty of evidence that groups can be more intelligent, but you heard me say several times under the right conditions.
Right.
And indeed, we all know that groups can also be collectively very stupid.
We've heard seen that as well.
You've seen that in history. You've probably heard the concept groupthink. So a number of key conditions must be put together for a group to think better together than not. Do you want me to go through those?
Yeah, no, actually, maybe we can get to this a bit later. So we start with the definitions and then we will uncover.
Okay, I lost track of the definition. So collective intelligence, ability to solve problems and better together. Collective creativity is maybe a subset of this because, as I mentioned before, creativity is a form of intelligence. It's an ability to solve problems also, but producing original solutions rather than just the standard ones. Remember my example of, I get locked out of my house, and very often the standard solution is fine. Call in the locksmith, knock on the door of my neighbor, maybe that's fine. So collective creativity is the ability for a group to come up with novel solutions better than the individual members would have done. Now, in this, for creativity as an ability to produce original and useful solutions, imagination is a key ingredient.
Let's talk about a very specific example, like Convention citoyenne du climat. So there was this citizens' convention about climate change in France. Was it collective creativity? Was it collective thinking? Well, certainly it was not simply creative thinking because there were several hundreds of people thinking together. So was it just collective thinking or was it creative collective thinking?
Well, it certainly was collective intelligence, collective thinking, because lots of conditions were put together to allow this group to be collectively more intelligent. So you had 150 participants, if I'm not wrong. So one of the first ingredients of collective intelligence is the collective part, right? Mm-hmm. Bringing more people together. The second ingredient is, in the jargon, cognitive diversity. So making sure that in that larger group, you have different perspectives, people with different experience of life, different ways of seeing things, etc. And because that citizens' assembly was put together by drawing by lot citizens from around France, you had a lot of diversity in the group, people of different age, different socioeconomic background, etc. Another key ingredient is the ability for that group to deliberate and exchange and listening to each other, allowing counter arguments to come about, dissenting views, contradictory arguments, etc. And they had lots of time with facilitators to do that.
So it's to have a process of everybody being able to express their opinion and to be listened and have a constructive discussion. So in this case, you need to have facilitators, right?
Yes, absolutely. In a case like such as this one, where people are actually talking together in order to have quality listening, while allowing people to express their disagreements and to form an independent judgment. Facilitators, independent, neutral facilitators will help. So certainly you had, and I could go on, some key ingredients that allowed the group to be collectively more intelligent than if it had just been a conversation in the pub about climate change, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, was it creative? I don't think it was designed to foster the group's ability to come up with novel solutions. Their task was more to consider the options at hand and to weigh their merits and limits, their pros and cons. So in the 149 recommendations that they produced, the most of the recommendations were in that toolbox I was referring to at the beginning of our conversation. They were things that are been identified by scientists, NGOs, policymakers. What was novel here was more the process of conversation and the deliberation itself. The solutions were not particularly unusual.
Did those people have a list of the solutions and they discussed what should be used, or did they come up with the solutions by themselves?
As far as I know, the former, considered lots of options that were put across to them by different experts, different people. Now, what is novel, and that's important, I think this is a great illustration of a form of creativity that we need in climate change. It's not so much that they said, hey, actually, we need to paint lakes purple and have people eat purple apples, right? Like your creative ideas a few minutes ago. No, and that would have been maybe original, but not so useful solutions. No, they came up with fairly standard recommendations that had been well studied. For instance, lowering the speed limit on highways. Okay, we know that will have a positive impact on CO2 emissions. What was novel of the government and the NGOs that promoted the process was, well, what if we considered those solutions in a different way so that they gain greater acceptance in society? If it's not something that our government tells us to do, but it's citizens who look like us and consider these things and tell us, well, hey, we thought about this, we took time, and they make sense, maybe it will help convey the message and gain greater acceptance. And that worked to a large extent. It popularized, it made more popular many recommendations of experts other citizens were not aware of. Doesn't mean that they all suddenly became popular, like lowering speed limits on highways. Well, that didn't work. But other options became better known and more accepted. It generated a debate. So the novelty here wasn't so much in the substance, but in the way of conducting the conversation.
Mm-hmm. And for you, do you think there should be more impact if there was a creative component? Or do you think it was already a very good, a very well set up exercise by itself? Or do you think there is like the creativity could have added a little bit more there?
That's an interesting consideration. Maybe if the group not only had been deliberating options that are out there, but producing its own original solutions, it would have caught more the media's attention and other citizens' attention. Now, I think the major stumbling blocks of this collectively intelligent setting wasn't that they weren't encouraged to think more outside the box. It was more the institutional setup where, as many people I'm sure among your listeners know, the French president who had invited the Citizens' Assembly had originally said, I will take on board everything that comes out of your discussions here and put it to Parliament. And in the end, because they proposed very sound and ambitious measures, some lobby groups came out of the woodworks and said to the government officials, hey, we don't want this. This is dangerous for our jobs, our industries, etc. And the public authorities, became very shy about implementing or promoting some of the measures identified by the citizens. So in the future, I guess one would need to take that constraint into account. How to anticipate the reaction of groups that have vetted interests and will lobby fiercely to oppose the measures recommended by citizens who have taken the time to think carefully about an issue. We face clearly a constraint, and we need to address this creatively.
Mm-hmm. Like, for example, inviting them as being a part of the discussion group.
Hey, this is very potentially something to think about. Yes, how to integrate them more without diluting the process. I recently worked with the Parliament of Wallonia, the southern region of Belgium, which noticed that these citizens' assemblies, if they work in isolation, face that difficulty of transferring their recommendations. So they decided to combine a citizens' assembly with a parliamentary committee. So the integration is not downstream, it's upstream in the deliberative process. So in fact, people are learning from these processes. And this is a form of administrative creativity, inventing a new form of parliamentary committee in which you invite citizens. They call them deliberative committees. So maybe in the future, this will be done also with lobby groups. Who knows?
Mm-hmm. And that's a very good transition, because indeed I wanted to move to what you're doing. And so bringing creativity to the public affairs. And here, well, again, some maybe cliche thinking that public affairs doesn't seem to be very creative. So it's more about being bureaucratic and maybe routine than creative. So how do you see the process? Where do you see the creativity, or where the creativity can actually bring additional benefits to the public affairs?
Yeah, creativity and public administration sound like they belong in different worlds. There's a festival in Germany called the Creative Bureaucracy Festival. So they actually play on that oxymoron. But in fact, in this Petit Manuel de Créativité Politique I published a few years ago, the little handbook of political creativity, I tell 23 stories of public administrative bodies that were very creative in different ways, or policymakers in different shapes. So there is every day civil servants out there, or interest groups, or NGOs, etc., that come up with novel solutions, because that's what we need to do. I found that quite inspiring, and I think many citizens would benefit from hearing some of these positive stories of, these officials who think and sweat to produce some solutions that are original in their context. So to give you an example, but that's quite a dramatic one, I love the story of how Bogota, the capital of Colombia, invented itself some 20 years ago with some because they had huge constraints, a lot of violence, limited budget, the mafia or the gangs, etc. And they faced huge problems. So they had to be very creative, and they were in the way they introduced. They managed acts of violence on the street, or people not driving properly, or people not paying fines, etc. I encourage you to look online, Bogota. There's a video called "Cities on Speed" and the case of Bogota there. And there's, as I mentioned in my book, there's 23 stories. There's lots of stories like this where, at some point, even quote unquote, even civil servants can be extremely creative They don't get as much publicity as the Salvador Dali's or Steve Jobs of this world, but they can be extremely creative.
And so, what the solution did they come up with? And how did they organize the process to come up with this solution?
So, one example. When Antanas Mokus was elected mayor as an independent in the early 2000s, if my memory is correct, there were huge traffic problems, traffic jams, people burning red lights, lots of road accidents, road fatalities. And an issue was that the police was corrupt. So just asking the police to hand more fines didn't work because that just meant more bribes. So he sacked a significant share of the police force that had been identified as corrupt. He recruited mimes and clowns to replace them on the street. And instead of handing fines to people who burnt red lights, who parked on the sidewalk, who crossed the zebra crossing when pedestrian was crossing, whatever misbehavior, these clowns and mimes would make fun of the people, would put ridicule, on them. And that turned out to be much more effective because people didn't like to be put in the spotlight on the streets. That's one example, the most dramatic of the many things that his administration did. His administration and the following mayor did a number of radical things like this. Now, how did they come about this? Well, it's difficult to summarize such a rich case, but basically, I think one of the key ingredients was being very much observant of what were people's values and aspirations, being very careful what touched people.
Mm-hmm. So maybe then we can move indeed to be a little bit more specific on this creative solution. Talk about what are really the characteristics of creative solutions, how to organize the process. Maybe there are some elements that people should keep in mind when they want to come up with a creative solution, and what are the necessary conditions to provide such solutions.
Okay, so that's three big questions which deserve Handbook of Political Creativity. I have a checklist of 8 elements that characterize what I have identified as creative policy solutions. You've heard me share the first 2, which are a creative policy, a creative administrative measure, creative policy proposal by a think tank or NGO, whatever, will first be original in a given context. That doesn't mean crazy original, but it's unusual. It hasn't been tried in that context. And impactful. It's not just different. It actually solves the problem, right? It's effective. But as we have seen, if we take the example of climate change, you can think of many measures in our toolbox that maybe are somewhat original in a given context and could solve the issue, but they still don't work. Well, one of the reasons is that these measures are not timely enough. So a third characteristic is that we manage to produce the solutions at the right moment. It's fine being creative, but too late. That you won't be remembered as the creative person who solved the problem if you were too late, right?
So any examples that you have in mind
of a solution that was potentially original and useful, but late?
Like about this being timely.
What I mean by timely is that it helps address the problem at the right moment. So in a sense, if you think of, and that's where my frustration and my desire to study creativity emerged from, if you look at all the tools that we have in our toolbox, insulating buildings, switching to renewable energies, stopping deforestation, etc., as a society, we will not be remembered by history as having been creative because We knew the solutions, but we didn't find how to implement them in a timely fashion, right? We will be remembered by history as having struggled with the problem and implemented solutions in a slow fashion, leaving lots of consequences for the following generations. So there are some bright, shining examples of measures that emerge and that help make a significant difference in relation to climate change, environmental problems, biodiversity, etc. I'm thinking of, for instance, the rewilding movement. If you look at the huge zone, I forgot what the name is, the huge region in northern Patagonia, which was bought by some rich philanthropists and very short. That's an original approach that has taken some by surprise. Oh, wow, we didn't think we could do this. It was original. It has been original. It has been impactful. It makes a huge difference. Biodiversity flourishes in these zones. Are we timely in addressing, in developing the solution? Yes and no. It comes at a right time, in, let's say, in that region of northern Patagonia, but we could introduce it in other regions fast. A solution that will be remembered by us citizens, by us people, as being creative will have other characteristics. It will be efficient. It will not only be effective, but it will be efficient, i.e., it won't cost more and it won't impose more than other solutions. And that goes hand in hand with the notion that it will be accepted and implemented by the people who are concerned about it. You may remember how, well, as a French citizen, I certainly remember the Yellow Vest movement on the back of a number of measures on climate change that made sense to lots of people and the parliamentarians in France, but was vehemently rejected by a certain section of society. And therefore, no matter how timely, useful, and in some cases original the measures were in that context of France, new measures, well, you couldn't implement them. And actually, that's where very often we have our toolbox, but we need to be creative in getting it accepted and communicating it, etc.
And I think you're touching upon an interesting point. It's not only the solution which has to be creative. It's from the creation of the solution to the implementation of the solution that we have to be creative, right? That's what you're talking about, is that, we came up maybe with an original solution, but then it was not being implemented in a way that would be accepted by the whole society. Maybe the government, the public administrators, they should have been also thinking to be a little bit more original in how they would like to implement the solution that people accepted.
Absolutely. And here, if you allow me to anticipate the next question, the following question you asked me earlier, how do you foster these characteristics? Often we associate creativity with brainstorming, right? Producing new ideas. Well, actually, if you want to solve a problem, we tend to distinguish 4 phases. The first is analyzing, understanding the problem at hand.
Asking the right question, being creative at asking the question.
Exactly. Because you could be otherwise producing solutions about the wrong question and addressing the wrong question. So first, clarifying the issue. Second, okay, we've done that. We're clear that what we're trying to address here is this challenge, not that challenge. You can produce solutions. So in the jargon, it's the ideation phase, right? Which can be with the brainstorming method or lots of other methods. But once you've done that, you're only halfway. What you want to do next is turn these ideas into an action plan. How are we going to implement this or that levy or this or that communications campaign, etc.? And once you have your action plan, you need to implement them. And it happens that at each of these phases, we're going to need to be creative. And what's encouraging about this is that although we tend to associate creativity with the brainstorming form of ideation, well, different people are creative in different ways at different stages. Some are very creative in understanding issues, some at producing solutions, some at turning these into action plans, and people different than me at implementing them.
Is there a creativity test that could help identify in which stage of the creative process the person is more efficient? Like, is it about creating the ideas or is it about the implementation?
Yeah, and forgive me for advertising the only organization I know who does this test. It's called the Foresight test, but four as in the number, Four, sight as in seeing. Remember my encouragement that the first step is to become aware that we have different forms of creativity and we can all unleash and cultivate our creativity. So that's a great tool in a team to realize, well, hey, if I look at my Foresight profile, I tend to be higher than average in terms of creativity in the first stage, analytical, and in the second stage, ideation. And I need the help of others for the action plan, let's say transformation phase and the implementation phase. And when you do this test within a team, you realize that people score high on certain parts of the four steps and less so on others. And as a team, you have all the creativity you need. So it's important. That's one of the key recommendations also as next steps. Not only realize that you have creativity, that you need it, be clear why, and then understand what is your type of creativity and who you need around you to solve your problems.
When you gave this example about Colombia and the clowns on the streets, and you said they were very observative of what was needed. So, which stage of the process was it? Was it still the clarifying of the question, like to understand what would trigger the people's attention?
So I do not know enough about the process that led them to produce these solutions. For not having been part of it, witnessed it, or interviewed people close to it. I've read accounts of it. So, from what I understand, one of the key factors, as I mentioned, was being very observant of the situation and understanding what mattered to people on the immediate issue. So, I think that was the analytical phase. Is it a matter of road safety, or is there something wider here that we need to address? So, for instance, after Antanas Mokus, there was another mayor from a different party, Enrique Peñalosa, who saw that the issue of delinquency and violence on the streets was not just a matter of people being violent. It was a matter of how society interacted and people interacted with each other. And that led him and his administration to realize that one thing that would help would be developing sidewalks everywhere in the street so that people could walk on the sidewalks, could stand on their doorstep, could have maybe a little business on the sidewalk. And that created more interaction on the streets, more social interaction. So by reframing, by understanding the issue differently, that led to different solutions. So I think, without having been part of it, that being open-minded about what is at hand, what's happening, and how is it connected to what people want was critical.
Mm-hmm. Any additional words on the process, how to arrive to the creative solutions, and maybe also the usual mistakes that people do, and in this case, missing the solution, the creative, the original solution.
So there's tons of books if you look on your favorite platform, sharing tips and methods how to be creative. What I'd like to highlight is three things. So there's the four phases. So if you want to develop novel solutions and make sure they happen, we just covered that. Second, within these four phases, and that is part of the creative problem solving approach that I recommend and have been trained in, we tend to distinguish a divergent and a convergent phase. Divergent is when you multiply facts, options, ideas, etc., and convergent is when you narrow it down and agree. And it's important to distinguish the two, because if you don't give yourself time to multiply options, well, you tend to stick to what you know and the common ideas. And that's true for every phase. So for instance, analytical part, if you say, okay, we're going to talk about managing pensions in France, well, I could list you the three typical measures that French political parties talk about. Whereas in analyzing the problem, we could see all the many dimensions of the problem and be divergent in that and rephrase the issue. So same in every stage. So 4 phases, in each of them, divergent and convergent phase. Third thing, there's
Can I just say, so this divergent and convergent thinking, in the divergent, you don't censor. So like you just say everything. It's not the moment when you criticize or you use your analytical mind. It's really, saying or writing whatever comes to the mind. And the more options, the more ideas you write, the better it is, because you need to write a certain amount of very basic, very non-original ideas to get rid of in order to get to the next stage where you start thinking creatively. And if we use at this moment our censorship or critical thinking, there is no way we will arrive to anything original.
Yes, that is very true. And certainly you're describing it here again in the ideation phase, but it's true like for your plan of action. How are we going to implement this? Lots of options will allow you to maybe overcome the usual problem. So if the French Citizens Assembly on Climate Change had been given extra time to think of how could we transform this into an action plan. So they might have listened to the lobby groups and their resistance. They might have invited parliamentarians to hear how do you receive our recommendations. And they might have been creative in recommending an action plan, how to transform them. What are the next steps now with these recommendations? You can imagine an extension. And then a convergent phase. Okay, we recommend an action plan. And then the implementation. So at every phase, indeed, the key rule of divergence are quantity, lots of options, because the first options tend to be the most obvious ones and not the original ones, and deferring judgment. In order to multiply options, you want to refrain from saying, yes, but this might be too costly, yes, but we may not get approval. Yes, that is true, but that we will take into account in the convergent phase to analyze and choose and prioritize, etc.
Was there something else you wanted to say before I cut you?
So the third element I wanted to share in terms of how to make this happen. Again, I'll summarize significant body of work in just a few words, but there's this author from the Harvard Business School, Professor Teresa Amabile, and she has a book, an article called How to Kill Creativity. So if you want to kill creativity, by interviewing and observing hundreds of organizations, she saw that basically overall you need 3 types of ingredients. To have creativity, you need expertise. So basically, if you ask me to be creative, how to, I don't know, something that I don't know about, produce weapons faster to help Ukraine defend itself, that's not my area of expertise. I won't be creative in that field. I have no idea, right? So expertise is needed when you're tackling complex problems. Then know-how. How do you get people to work together? And that's the if you want, that maybe the creativity methods, the collective intelligence methods. And if you observe in organizations, that's usually the 2 things that they most easily identify. Okay, we're going to need to send Liera on a course on X and Y, and we need to recruit a new person who knows a lot about this or that, and we're going to improve their skills, etc. The third factor she identified, which tends to be, if not neglected, but more difficult to tackle, is motivation. Okay, you and I have been tasked with thinking about a problem. We have lots of expertise. We've been trained into creativity techniques, let's imagine. But the challenge we've been given is maybe, uninspiring. We've been asked to tackle a small challenge and we won't be giving our best. Or maybe the opposite. We'll be given a huge challenge and it's just overwhelming. We don't have enough time. We don't have enough resources to tackle it. Saying we're going to be demotivated. So I'm summarizing, there's a lot more behind what she says, but cultivating the motivation of people to give their best when addressing a creative challenge is an important factor. So expertise, know-how, and motivation, in addition to dividing the process into these 4 steps, is important.
So indeed, from what you are saying, creativity from a bit abstract, mythic notion becomes something which is relatively well studied, also well applied, well processed. So all you need to come up with the original solution is to follow a certain process and to avoid the certain psychological biases, so certain psychological traits that can prevent this process working properly. And then basically any collective or any person with a certain expertise and the right motivation can arrive to an original solution. So it's like creativity demystified in a way.
Absolutely. When you look at what the key recommendations, they almost seem quite common sense. Make sure you've defined your problem adequately. Make sure you take time to produce solutions with a divergent and a convergent phase, distinguishing the two so that you defer judgment. Make sure you turn those ideas into an action plan, because otherwise they'll just be pie in the sky ideas. And then make sure you're creative in the implementation process. That sounds all very common sense. On top of this, then at each step, because there's been so many people studying this, practicing this, there are specific methods, but one shouldn't be mystified by these methods, whether the most well-known brainstorming or others. They're highly achievable, implementable. It's not nuclear science. And that's where, if you follow these basic rules and you do it properly, you respect this process, you can, each of you listeners, go look out for these methods and practice them. And you will see that, and I'm always amazed with the groups I work with, a little bit of attention to these processes can turn an awfully boring meeting or parliamentary committee process or other collective endeavor much more creative, because we do not cultivate our creative muscles much.
Mm-hmm. And I hope it won't be too much of an overstatement, but these processes have been used already for years, if not decades, by biggest corporations, by NASA, by the research institutes, right? So this is something which has really been practiced and well documented and in the toolkit of most companies that have come up with the innovative solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. That's to share an anecdote. That's what got me first curious about this, because I was at Harvard at some point and we were being offered all these courses, and I was at the Kennedy School of Government, but I could take courses at the business school. And then I saw that in the syllabus of the business school, you had all these exciting sounding courses like design thinking for greater success, or creativity and innovation for better management, etc. And I thought, hey, how come we don't have similar sounding courses to tackle public problems? And I went to the library, to the Harvard Library, and I typed creativity politics, and I found literally at the time 4 titles in that huge library. And I typed creativity business, and I had a list of hundreds of references. And I thought, this was 20 years ago. I thought there's something strange here. There should be lots of people studying how to foster creativity in politics. And thank God I wasn't the only one with that brainwave, and this has become a major field of study. So, and thankfully so.
Maybe you can give some inspiring example from your own work with the, I don't know, with the governments or with whom you're working. One of really your projects which you're very proud of and which can give some inspiration to the listeners of applying creativity to well, not necessarily to public affairs, but maybe just to their own problems.
Mm-hmm. Well, unfortunately, it's no longer published. We'll be sharing on Dreamocracy's website over the summer some of the key content of this little handbook of political creativity, these 23 case studies and lessons to be learned from it. So watch the space, dreamocracy.eu. We will be sharing many inspiring examples there. And also I mentioned this Routledge Handbook of Collective Intelligence, which is less focused on creativity, but you have examples there also. For instance, a cool case of how in the state of New York, they use the creative problem-solving approach, CPS, to tackle matters related to youth delinquency. So hopefully we can share the links at the bottom of your podcast. So,
is there something from your own experience? Like something where you could give a bit more details? I mean, if this is not confidential.
Yeah, we're working with the European paper industry. So the Confederation, the Trade Federation of Manufacturers of Paper in Europe. That industry, about 10 years ago, was very innovative in the way it decided to tackle the issue of climate change. Realizing that they had to reduce drastically their greenhouse gas emissions, as the European institutions were inviting them to do. And unlike other energy-intensive industries, they decided to tackle the issue and in a very innovative way. They basically organized a competition within the industry. So trade federation at EU level, national trade federations, member companies. They organized a competition how to crack that challenge of coming up with of achieving 80% emissions reductions by 2050. The game they organized, the gamification of the process was in itself innovative and led to lots of innovative solutions, from technological solutions to management solutions, to rethinking the role of the industry and revenue streams, etc. It was called the two-team project at the time internally. I find this example very inspiring. With virtually no budget and no consultants involved, a whole industry decided to think, we realized that they had to think outside the usual box, and they managed to. So that is also a case that can be found online, and I'll be happy to share the links.
Any final words? Something maybe that we haven't covered, which was important?
So one thing I'd like to leave with your listeners is that one of the key amazing benefits of the creative process of fostering creativity in a group is that it generates a lot of energy. The subtitle I had for my handbook of political creativity was How to Unleash Collective Audacity. Because I've witnessed case after case how groups that decide that they can dream large, redefine problems, come up with novel solutions, and get them implemented. It's a very human process of creation. It's deeply human, it's deeply exciting, and it's a major cure against some of the huge challenges that we are facing. It doesn't mean it's easy, right? It's the problems are huge, the constraints are huge, but suddenly with creativity, well organized, we're empowered to do something about it. So it's not just something useful to do, it's also something that can be hugely meaningful in one's life or in an organization.
Yeah, it's like getting back our agency, that we are
Absolutely.
capable of changing things.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, Stephen. Sorry for misspelling it the first time. A lot of wonderful references. I will put them all in the description of the podcast so that the listeners can find them. And well, I very much enjoyed the discussion and hope the listeners as well.
Thank you, Didiana.